Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm a Ukrainian Canadian. Today is October 1st, 2024, and let's get to the news and map updates happening in Ukraine and Russia, shall we? So let's talk about the good stuff, the good news, and then I'll cover some more negative, unfortunate news happening in Donbass. So let's talk about Vovchansk, because yesterday we were treated with some wonderful footage by the Ukrainian forces in their defense of the aggregate plant in the city center of Vovchansk. So we talked about it the previous video, that the Ukrainian forces were able to recapture this aggregate plant last week. And now the Russians mounted a counterattack yesterday to try to retake the aggregate plant. They had dozens of MTLBs that they were operating, and they had also thrown hundreds of soldiers for this counterattack. Fortunately, they were defeated. The Ukrainian drone operators obliterated these MTLBs, on which dozens of Russian soldiers were also sitting on top of. So this is a great defense by the Ukrainian soldiers, and I just wanted to pass on the good news for you guys. You can see how important for the Russians this aggregate plant is to be able to really hold the northern part of the city. So this would allow eventually, if the Russians are too exhausted, for the Ukrainians to mount a counterattack and drive the Russians out of Vovchansk. Then they pretty much have an open field back into the Russian borders. So this is showcasing how important for the Russians the small aggregate plant really is. However, now we must talk about some more sad news. And so first of all, Pokrovsk remains a very difficult front line for the Ukrainian soldiers. The situation has not been stabilized for several months now. The Russians continue pushing, and unfortunately it appears that they still have the momentum here. So it's slow, it's not fast, but it's slow for the Russians, and you can see that the Ukrainians still have a lot of difficulty trying to hold off this entire front line, which is very dynamic. So right now the Russians are really focusing heavily around the area of Selidove. So this is the city that the Russians must take before they can start storming Pokrovsk. You can see that Selidove is quite large as a city. It has multiple blocks, multiple buildings, and the Ukrainians right now are holding the city very strong. So this is good news. So this expectation that Russians will get to Pokrovsk within early October doesn't seem to be true. And you can see the Ukrainians are making another hard defense in other areas as well. So Selidove is very important because then there's an open road towards Pokrovsk, and there's another kind of open road towards Kurakhove, which is also very problematic for the Russians. You can see that here in Kurakhove alone, the Russians have lost hundreds of armored vehicles in the previous years, and we're always getting sweet footage from the Ukrainian 46th Brigade of how they're obliterating these Russian tanks and BMPs that are being used to storm Kurakhove, because essentially this is an extremely open field. There is a few roads which lead into Kurakhove, and so the Russians are just very exposed here as they launch their assault. So this is an extremely important city to hold for the Ukrainians. Unfortunately as well, you guys can see that Vuhledar has been taken by the Russians, which will eventually put a lot more pressure towards Kurakhove. Today it's been confirmed that the Russians are in control of Vuhledar. The 72nd Brigade held the defense of this city for over 25 months. For a city, let me remind my viewers, that is less than 14,000 people. Now, that was prior to the war. A very small city, and the Russians lost so many brigades, so many armored vehicles, in the hundreds. And the Russian soldiers that died here are in the thousands, tens of thousands. So this is a Pyrrhic victory for the Russians at best. And this is, as you guys can see, this is the constant theme within Donbass, is Pyrrhic victories for Russia. Yeah, they took Avdiivka, but again, at what cost? Yes, they continue pushing, but Ukraine doesn't have the choice but to defend right now because of the sheer concentration of Russian forces here. How well prepared they were as well since 2014. Remember that the Russians created a massive fortress out of Donbass, the area that they controlled between 2014 till 2022. They reinforced their logistics. They rebuilt some airfields, some military bases, right? Everything has been turned into a massive fortress. And so for the Ukrainians to launch a counterattack in Donbass would be suicidal, knowing that the Ukrainians right now don't have the manpower to be able to do so. Imagine the millions of bombs, the hundreds of thousands of soldiers that are necessary to retake even Avdiivka. It's a massive feat. So Ukraine right now, unfortunately, doesn't have the choice but to continue its the creation of Pyrrhic scenarios for Russia where, yes, they take cities that they believe to be crucial for them, but at a massive cost. And does somebody really believe that Russia could continue with this type of pressure for 3 more years? I personally seriously doubt it. I think that 2025 will really start showing the cracks within the foundation of Russia. And I'll talk about it in my next slides, because this brings me to the slides that I have prepared for you guys. And there's a sociology as well. Recent sociology, a survey that came out of Russia, which showcases that the Russians are getting more and more tired of this war because they don't understand what the goal is. And, you know, the Kremlin is really being vague about the goals. So as I've said, I'm repeating myself here, but Ukraine right now is, you know, they're fighting a war of attrition. Both sides are fighting a war of attrition. It's not about, you know, oh, now that Russia controls Vovchansk, the war is over. We clearly understand the war is not over. Ukraine is not planning on negotiating right now with Russia. And so it's just going to be the next town, the next city, and Ukraine is going to try to pull out constant massive casualties for the Russians until the Russians are completely exhausted, their military is unable to conduct offensives, and then perhaps Ukraine can start striking back indirectly or indirectly, whether on Russian territory or start an offensive of its own, which is less likely, but we're really hoping for a Russian collapse internally for Ukraine to be able to retake Donbass and the south of Ukraine. This is the most likely scenario, in my opinion, at this stage, the more realistic scenario, rather than anticipating Ukraine to mount a large offensive in a year or two in whether it be Zaporizhia or Donbass. It's less likely now, as we know that both sides are getting more and more exhausted, and this is really a war of attrition. Now, let's go to the map, not the map updates, but the news updates, because I need to talk about the new chief of NATO. His name is Mark Rutte. He's a Dutch politician. And this is really good news for Ukraine, because we know how the Netherlands are the biggest supporters of Ukraine, especially after MH17. There's not a single Dutch person that will forgive Russia for what they've done to these innocent civilians. And so he's going to be he is the new NATO chief. And he came out with very good remarks, pro-Ukraine remarks. Of course, this is expected, but it's good to see that he basically mentioned that there cannot be any lasting security in Europe without a strong and independent Ukraine. We like to hear that. He also mentioned that Ukraine's rightful place is in NATO, although they don't want to answer the timeline of Ukraine's membership in NATO. He also mentioned that the cost of supporting Ukraine is far, far lower than the cost that we could face if we allow Putin to get his way and take what he wants to take in Ukraine and other countries in Europe. And also another important remark is about China, where he put them essentially on the map by saying that they're the enabler of this war by providing key technologies and resources to Russia and still being one of the largest trading partners with Russia. And China cannot continue to fuel the largest conflict in Europe since the Second World War without this impacting its interests and reputation. So a lot of good remarks by Mark Rutte. And there's also some rumors that I heard today that the Biden administration could push for Ukrainian NATO membership by the end of his presidency. It is probable, now this is my personal opinion and assumption, that Biden right now is not doing anything decisive because he doesn't want to hurt Kamala Harris's chances during the November elections. So right now he's playing it safe, not making any crucial decisions, and I'm anticipating Biden to make those crucial decisions, whether it be permit Ukraine to use long-range weapons or pushing Ukraine into a NATO membership after the elections, US elections in November. So this could be perhaps NATO's and the US's strategy for November. But again, time will tell. And as we've seen, actions do speak louder than words. So although we like to hear these nice words against Russia and being pro-Ukraine, actions do speak louder. Ukraine needs to have more support and more resources to be able to defeat Russia and attack Russia on their own territory, which is, as we're seeing, is not happening right now. Now, the next news, and I promise you guys I will talk about some sociology within Russia. So this is a really important survey that came out, and we need to have these surveys to understand what the ordinary Russian is thinking. Again, you may take it with a grain of salt because a lot of sociology surveys are manipulated, but this one seems to be very negative, which showcases that this could be more or less a neutral survey that was conducted. So basically mentions that there's more and more Russians that want this war to end in Ukraine. It's a record number. They mentioned that 49% of respondents, and let me remind my viewers that the sample size for this survey was 5,500 people, so very significant. It wasn't just 50 or 100 people that were surveyed, it was a large population. Now, 49% of them expressed their readiness to support a peace agreement, even if the goals of the special military operation, as Russians substitute the term war, remain unfulfilled. 33% are against this, but also 18% cannot answer the question, meaning that at the very least, about half of Russian people, if we're taking this survey as a direct kind of comparison to the entirety of the Russian population, half of Russian people are ready to find some sort of peace agreement with Ukraine right now. And 18% at best, so could be up to 70% of them, because they don't want to answer this question. They're trying to be safe. They're very careful because they know that the Putin regime is very repressive, so they don't want to respond truthfully. So we could even assume that 70% of Russians are essentially willing to start negotiating and find a peaceful agreement with Ukraine, whatever that means for them. It's also reported that fewer and fewer Russians are ready to fight. There is a decrease from February 2023 to September 2024 of the number of those who are not ready to go to war. It increased by 10%, basically. And you know why it matters, as it's mentioned in this article, is that the goals are just unclear for the Russians. What are they going for? The entirety of Ukraine, denazify Kiev, as they like to say it, attack NATO countries. What is the goal? Right? Is it taking back just Donbass? Is it going after Donbass and Dnipropetrovsk Oblast and other oblasts in Ukraine? Just the sheer amount of back and forth, statements from the Kremlin in terms of what their goals are confuses the Russians. They don't know what that means, right? Is the war going to be indefinite? Are we going to start going for Kiev, for Dnipro city? Other larger cities on the West Bank, on the western side of Ukraine, they don't know. It's 3 years and Russia is unable to form a clear goal for the Russian population. So I think that they're getting tired of that. But again, let me remind my viewers that this doesn't mean that this is just Putin's war. The Russian people are innocent. They just want peace. They don't want peace. They're not against this war. They just are realizing that their lives are being impacted by this war. Hyperinflation, massive economic problems are going to happen in 2025 for Russia. Lack of just decent services now, as thousands of men are dying every single day. Government repression of the media. Just basically your life is miserable in Russia right now. And Ukraine, can make it even worse if it was to be given permission to utilize long-range weapons like Storm Shadows, Atacams, Taurus missiles. Imagine the sheer increase of the increase of people ready to make a peace agreement with Ukraine and Russia. That could really impact that. And to finish off this video, a great announcement by Zelensky that Ukraine has finally finished and completed the tests of the domestically produced ballistic missile. I believe this is the Hrim 2 ballistic missile that Ukraine has been developing in the last few years. I've talked about it numerous times, but Ukraine claims that they have a range of up to 750 kilometers. It's still not really clear about all the spec sheet, but it's a very devastating ballistic missile if the performance is true. And now Zelensky mentions that Ukraine has successfully tested them. Now, of course, it matters the quantity that Ukraine can produce per year, and hopefully that quantity will increase as time goes by, but expect Ukraine to use them in the next few weeks. Hopefully within this month, we'll start seeing them in action to start striking Russian bases within Russia. And you can expect that this will have a huge impact on Russians supporting this war as they see their ammunition depots being obliterated, their military bases being obliterated, other strategic buildings and infrastructure being destroyed by Ukraine, which allows Russia to conduct their offensive operation within Ukraine. So as Ukraine develops its own missile program and its own missiles itself that they can use themselves, this is really going to be important in stopping this war and giving an advantage to Ukraine to answer back as well against Russia. That's the video for today, guys. I hope you enjoy my updates. Let me know in the comment section what you guys think about any of the topics I covered today. I always read your comments. I try to read as many comments as I can. I'm really appreciative for your support of this channel and your support for Ukraine. It's absolutely crucial that you guys continue funding Ukraine's war effort against Russia, its defense against Russia. So with all that said, thank you. Slava Ukraini!